This is Process and Reality, the only officially unofficial guide to reading Alfred North Whitehead. I'm your host, Tyler Davis. Welcome to the show. Well, welcome back. Hope you're enjoying yourself. We're just going to continue on. I believe we are now at Section 3, Episode 6. We just finished a small excursus on Descartes and Spinoza. And these comparisons, their relevance will become more apparent as time goes on. So, page 7, section 3. In its turn, every philosophy will suffer a deposition. But the bundle of philosophic systems expresses a variety of general truths about the universe, awaiting coordination and assignment of their various spheres of validity. Such progress in coordination is provided by the advance of philosophy, and in this sense, philosophy has advanced from Plato onwards. According to this account of the achievement of rationalism, the chief error in philosophy is overstatement. The aim at generalization is sound, but the estimate of success is exaggerated. There are two main forms of such overstatement. One form is what I have termed elsewhere the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This fallacy consists in neglecting the degree of abstraction involved when an actual entity is considered merely so far as it exemplifies certain categories of thought. There are aspects of actualities which are simply ignored so long as we restrict thought to these categories. Thus, the success of a philosophy is to be measured by its comparative avoidance of this fallacy when thought is restricted within its categories. The other form of overstatement consists in a false estimate of logical procedure in respect to certainty and in respect to premises. Philosophy has been haunted by the unfortunate notion that its method is dogmatically to indicate premises which are severally clear, distinct, and certain, and to erect upon those premises a deductive system of thought. But the accurate expression of the final generalities is the goal of discussion and not its origin. Philosophy has been misled by the example of mathematics, and even in mathematics the statement of the ultimate logical principles is beset with difficulties, as yet insuperable. And now we move to the footnote. Cross-reference Principia Mathematica by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, Volume 1 Introduction and Introduction to the Second Edition. These introductory discussions are practically due to Russell, and in the second edition wholly so. The verification of a rationalistic scheme is to be sought in its general success and not in the peculiar certainty or initial clarity of its first principles. In this connection, the misuse of the ex absurdo argument has to be noted. Much philosophical reasoning is vitiated by it. The only logical conclusion to be drawn when a contradiction issues from a train of reasoning is that at least one of the premises involved in the inference is false. It is rashly assumed, without further question, that the peccant premise can at once be located. In mathematics, this assumption is often justified, and philosophers have been thereby misled. But in the absence of a well-defined categorical scheme of entities issuing in a satisfactory metaphysical system, every premise in a philosophical argument is under suspicion. Philosophy will not regain its proper status until the gradual elaboration of categorical schemes, definitely stated at each stage of progress, is recognized as its proper objective. There may be rival schemes inconsistent among themselves, each with its own merits and its own failures. It will then be the purpose of research to conciliate the differences. Metaphysical categories are not dogmatic statements of the obvious. They are tentative formulations of the ultimate generalities. If we consider any scheme of philosophic categories as one complex assertion and apply it to the logician's alternative, true or false, the answer must be that the scheme is false. The same answer must be given to a like question respecting the existing formulated principles of any science. The scheme is true with unformulated qualifications, exceptions, limitations, and new interpretations in terms of more general notions. We do not yet know how to recast the scheme into a logical truth, but the scheme is a matrix from which true propositions applicable to particular circumstances can be derived. We can at present only trust our trained instincts as to the discrimination of the circumstances in respect to which the scheme is valid. The use of such a matrix is to argue from it boldly and with rigid logic. The scheme should therefore be stated with the utmost precision and definiteness to allow of such argumentation. The conclusion of the argument should then be confronted with circumstances to which it should apply. The primary advantage thus gained is that experience is not interrogated with benumbing repression of common sense. The observation acquires an enhanced penetration by reason of the expectation evoked by the conclusion of the argument. The outcome from this procedure takes one of three forms. 1. The conclusion may agree with the observed facts. 2. The conclusion may exhibit general agreement with disagreement in detail. 3. The conclusion may be in complete disagreement with the facts. In the first case, the facts are known with more adequacy and the applicability of the system to the world has been elucidated. In the second case, criticisms of the observation of the facts and of the details of the scheme are both required. The history of thought shows that false interpretations of observed facts enter into the records of their observation, thus both theory and received notions as to fact are in doubt. In the third case, a fundamental reorganization of theory is required, either by way of limiting it to some special province or by way of entire abandonment of its main categories of thought. After the initial basis of a rational life, with a civilized language, has been laid, all productive thought has proceeded either by the poetic insight of artists or by the imaginative elaboration of schemes of thought capable of utilization as logical premises. In some measure or other, progress is always a transcendence of what is obvious. Rationalism never shakes off its status of an experimental adventure. The combined influences of mathematics and religion, which have so greatly contributed to the rise of philosophy, have also had the unfortunate effect of yoking it to static dogmatism. Rationalism is an adventure in the clarification of thought, progressive and never final. But it is an adventure in which even partial success has importance. The statement we're going to start off with today is that every philosophy has its day in court and gets judged by everyone. That's kind of the meaning of deposition, right? Everybody gets judged someday. Still, taken together, the collections of philosophical schools of thought express some general truths about the universe. These truths are waiting to be mapped to their significant application, and they're waiting for us to realize their relative validity. Furthermore, we advance in philosophy when we progress in connecting these general truths to lived experience and when we can express their validity in new systems of thought. In this way, philosophy has advanced from Plato onwards. You'll recall that Whitehead also says that Western philosophy has been a series of footnotes to Plato and Aristotle. This is precisely what we're getting at. There's not a lot of new stuff out there. It's more that we learn to analyze older ideas in light of new information. Now, the chief error of philosophy to Whitehead is overstatement. He thinks often our aim to arrive at general principles, which are universally applicable, is good. But although sometimes we have success and we find something that's worth exploring or is leading us towards some general principle, sometimes our estimate of what a success we have accomplished might be unrealistic or overstated. There are two forms of overstatement: fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is also known by the name the fallacy of reification. Whitehead does a very strange job of explaining this. I think he's more just thinking how it applies to his specific philosophy, but the fallacy of reification, or misplaced concrescence, misplaced concreteness, is essentially that you have mistaken an abstraction for reality. We forget how far removed in abstraction we are from the organism we're considering, for example. This is what Whitehead is beginning to say in this section. We forget how far abstracted we are from the organism that we're considering in our study. Then there are aspects of the organism we're ignoring when we are restricting examples for the purpose of general truths. We should measure the success of our philosophy by avoiding this fallacy and restricting our thought to the appropriate categories. So, for example, this is an example that I'm going to give you. A neuroscientist who considers everything solely through the lens of mind is committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness or reification by mistaking the abstract general ideas of the complex organism they have arrived at through narrow parameters of the discipline of neuroscience. This is an inappropriate use of their scientific discipline. People who only think in terms of mind or only think in terms of soul, or those kinds of things. You are taking an abstraction from one discipline, which works when you are reading and studying within that discipline, but when you apply it more broadly, it shows that you have not actually considered the holistic nature of the organism. The second way we can go wrong is through misjudgment of logical procedure. False estimate is what a misjudgment really is. We misjudge how to practically logically proceed when there's uncertainty, and so we make a misstep, or we misjudge how to proceed when we don't know for certain whether our premises are correct or not. But we should remember that our goal is not certainty for either of these at the start of our quest. Our goal is to accurately express the final generalities, these metaphysical first principles, at the end of our quest. So we're starting from a place of uncertainty, and that's okay. And we're not even necessarily going to end in a place of certainty. That's kind of the nature of our quest, is probably eternal. We are not starting out with what is it that I can set my foot on that's certain, okay? Now, we can't get hung up on trying to get everything perfect in our system before we begin working towards our goal of creating a pragmatic, realistic system. That's kind of another way of saying what I just said. The math tricks us into thinking that philosophy should be taken just like math. Math still has its own difficulties, though, when you try to make statements about the ultimate logical principles of the world. To this day, some of these issues are still impossible for us to overcome. And he cross-references the Introduction to Principia Mathematica, and Russell is the one who brings up these issues. We should seek to verify our rational philosophy with how successful it is in general, not by how certain we can be of the particulars, even the certainty of the first principles as we articulate them. For example, People misuse the ex absurdo argument all the time in philosophy by stating that the only logical conclusion of contradictions coming out of a rational system of thought is that at least one of the premises of the system is false. This is a misuse of the ex absurdo argument. It's a very arbitrary way to apply it. People often assume that they can immediately locate the peccant, or another way to say that is diseased premise, the problem area. In math, we get this justification for assuming this because you can point to where the problem is. And so philosophers have believed this to be true for philosophy as well. But when we don't have a well-defined categorical scheme of concepts, we aren't able to define this scheme from an adequate metaphysical system. Even every single premise that we make in philosophy is suspect. You also recall one of the starting no-nos is trusting in language as an adequate expression of propositions. Math is based off of propositional logic, and it's not done in verbal expressions. So you have to remember that what we are dealing with here is a less pure form of logic. We're dealing with some muddy gold here. You got to do a little more sifting. So the impact of this is that philosophy is not going to regain its proper status until we can finally recognize that our proper objective. And so what is that? Well, that's kind of his next point, is that our objective is to gradually elaborate a categorical framework as definitely as possible in each stage of the development. So what does that look like? Well, there's going to be rival schemes. So as long as there are more than one of us on the earth, there will be more than one rival scheme. We have to research and reconcile them as rival schemes arise. Each system is going to have its merits and its failures. There's something to be learned from everyone. Metaphysical categories, in the end, are not dogmatic statements of the obvious. They are tentative formulations of the ultimate generalities. So we're going to have a very tentative logical procedure. If we consider any philosophy as one complex assertion and apply it to a simple true-false test, then we always must conclude that the system is false every time. We also have to conclude the falsehood of every scientific body of knowledge, principles, and concepts ever to have existed, including right now. Essentially, the logical test of true and false applied to our premises, and that's is what we're getting back to, that ex absurdo. You're making an arbitrary decision to attack a premise as if you can identify the diseased one, as if that's a logical expectation to even have. But once you do it, you're applying a rigid, logical, true-false test that you won't even apply to your own scientific disciplines. That's the whole point of hypotheses testing. Eventually, you refine the search. You start broad and start moving narrower and narrower and narrower into the nature of things. That's just kind of the method of going into or inducting, is that you start sifting out, right, over time. And so without that ability to do that, you might as well say goodbye to all of the scientific progress that we've made. We don't want to get rid of that. So certain people, they get fired up and dogmatic about stuff, and then they throw out the baby with the bathwater, essentially hamstringing their own scientific endeavors. And really, they wouldn't ever do that if they knew that was what they were doing, but they're bad at the philosophy of science. So that's all we have to say about that. So instead, what do we want to do? We want to consider the philosophy to be true with unspoken or undiscovered qualifications, exceptions, limitations, new interpretations of known facts against the tentatively formed general ideas. When we first try to create a rational scheme, we don't know how to reformulate the scheme right away into logical truth. Instead, what I want you to do is think of our rational scheme like a matrix. A matrix is an environment or material in which something develops. It's a surrounding medium or structure. We can derive true propositions from our matrix, which is our rational scheme. This is our philosophy, our matrix. The true propositions we derive are applicable to particular circumstances. At the present, we can only trust our trained instincts to discriminate which particular circumstances demonstrate if the scheme is valid. But in order to use a matrix of ideas like this, we must argue boldly using rigid logic. Therefore, we need to state the scheme with precision so that our argument is intelligible, meaning that we have to compare the conclusion of our argument with the circumstances to which it should apply. This is essentially the basis of pragmatic process philosophy. You'll recall in the preface that Whitehead said that he wants to rescue James and Dewey from the charge of anti-intellectualism. There was the third one that I can't remember, but he's performing pragmatic philosophy in his own framework. The advantage of this pragmatic method is that we don't have to abuse our experience by repressing common sense. When using this method, our observations, they take on an enhanced penetration into the nature of reality just by the fact that the conclusion of our argument causes us to expect something important to come out of it. That might seem kind of cyclical and strange. I think it is a little bit of a weird way to put that. Here's my take on this. In other words, we're less likely to fail to penetrate into the nature of reality if we're expecting something to come out of our arguments that's relevant to our lived experience. The outcome of our observations takes one of three forms in this procedure. The conclusion seems to agree with the facts that we observe, and meaning that we know the facts well and we can demonstrate the applicability of our system to the facts. The second outcome is that the conclusion seems generally in agreement with the facts, but conflicts with the facts in some details. And so we have to critically analyze our observation of the facts and the details of the scheme. If we look at historical philosophy, we can see that false interpretation of observed facts gets interpolated or mixed up with the data. Just because you believe something doesn't make it true. However, you believing something actually has an effect on real reality. And so the way that you live in light of beliefs gets into everything, and that is also part of our data. So that can be problematic there itself. The philosophies themselves tend to try to reinforce their own existence by virtue of their philosophers. You get that mixed up in the data that you're trying to generalize from. So both in the theory and the received ideas from history about facts, we need to doubt those. The third one is that the conclusion seems to be in complete disagreement with the facts. We have to reorganize the accepted theory drastically by limiting the theory to a specialized area. For example, our theory only applies in biology or physics or communications, or we have to abandon the idea because it doesn't apply to any special area, or it's just outdated. For example, think alchemy and phrenology. Those are abandoned systems of thought themselves. Their antecedent kind of ideas get taken up by the more advanced sciences, but nobody is in those disciplines anymore. The next part I'm just going to kind of call an excursus. I think it's a little bit of an excursus until the end of the chapter here, the section. Whitehead says that after we lay an initial basis for rational philosophy applied to life using sophisticated language, the people who really do the heavy lifting are poets and artists, and those who are imaginative enough to elaborate on the philosophy so that they can utilize it in some other capacity using the same logical premise. There's a way in which philosophies don't really become popular until artists and poets take them on, and they're the ones who do the heavy lifting of generalizing them and taking those concepts to other disciplines, because they're the ones that, one, are imaginative enough to do it, and then two, they're brave enough to do it. As a subpoint of this, one way or another, progress is a transcendence of what is obvious. In rational philosophy, we can never get away from being experimental or adventurers. Religion and science have basically birthed philosophy as a discipline. Unfortunately, they've also attempted to tie it down to static dogmatism. Now, I think this is a little bit of a a strong about face here, kind of rigid transition. He is going to talk about this, but it's just kind of weird that he brings it up right here. But essentially, I guess the subpoint, this is a subpoint to the fact that this needs to be an imaginative endeavor, right? And so he's saying a lot of times the people who get this right the most are the artists, and he's saying religion and science, they've basically birthed philosophy as a discipline, but they also would try to tie it down to static dogmatism. And he's saying we need to be more like the artists and poets than the scientists and religious people in terms of our imaginations. As such, rationalism is an adventure where we go on a journey to clarify our thoughts. It's progressive and never final. Even partial success in this adventure is important. That's all I have for you today. I'll meet you next time for Section 4, Episode 7.